The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. Their goal is the overthrow of our government.
The Cold War filled that discomfort perfectly, beautifully, from the point of view of the establishment, because it gave us an enemy again. And Americans function best. We're team players to an extraordinary extent. Probably comes out of having to have settled the West and being able to function in communities. And so if you're a team player, you have to have an opponent. Otherwise, there's nothing more onerous than practicing on a team that plays no games. And so the big game became the Cold War. It gave encouragement to American paranoia, which is always present. American paranoia has to be present. It's a constant factor in American life. America is never more unhappy and more uncomfortable than when it doesn't have something to be paranoid about. Marx had an immense effect on me. I read Das Kapital in 1949. It affected my thinking forever, and I recommend Das Kapital to anyone who's going to read it, because you think better after you've read it, and you think with much more clarity, and you have a sense of the architectural construction of society, the way in which societies are put together. You don't have to agree with Marxism in order to get a powerful take on it. I never felt Marx was right in the sense of that communism was going to solve all our problems. But for a brief flirtation in the 1949, I was never even remotely near the Communist Party. And I felt it was bureaucratic. I felt that I would detest living in the Soviet Union. I never had any feeling that, no, I'm secretly a closet communist or anything of that sort. Life magazine is putting me on its pages among 50 famous communist rapscallions. The names are marvelous. I mean, I'll just read some of them aloud. What wonderful company to be in. There was Albert Einstein, there was Thomas Mann, there was Charlie Chaplin, there was Langston Hughes, there was Aaron Copland, Clifford Odets, Louis Untermeyer, Lillian Hellman. Marvelous names. Anyway, they were all part of Arthur Miller, Dorothy Parker. They were all part of what Life magazine called dupes and fellow travelers. You see, you have to understand something in the nature of American capitalism that not everybody talks about all the time. But we are very much a Christian nation, maybe more than any nation in Europe. Nations in Europe like France are Catholic, but they're accustomed to that Catholicism. They were living with it for centuries. It's one of the ingredients. It's like having mountains or valleys. It's there, but you don't fight to the death for your mountains or your valleys necessarily if they've been there for forever. And so, but in America, Christianity is a vital force. More Americans than not are probably devout Christians one way or another. And so what happens is the basic belief in Christianity is that you shouldn't be too wealthy. I mean, that's the fundament of Christianity, that the poor come first. And here America was getting rich at a great rate, and part of our ethic, part of our American ethic is that enrich yourself. It's very important. Capitalism depends upon people wanting to enrich themselves. And so there's this fundamental conflict built into the American character. We don't feel good about ourselves when we get rich, but on the other hand, we have to get rich or we have no value for ourselves. So you might say if you dare to speak of the American neurosis, it's this, that we've got to be rich, and yet a deep part of us is ashamed of being rich. And so communism filled the bill perfectly, because it was all right to get rich if you were fighting a force that was evil that would destroy Christianity. And so this propaganda was built up by every means, and very intelligent, powerful people were behind it. What I did during that period is I wrote 2 novels. I wrote Barbary Shore, and I wrote The Deer Park. And the Barbary Shore was my notion of what was going to happen. And so there's a witch hunt in the book, a sort of small, dramatic little witch hunt between a man who's never identified, but the reader can suppose he's some sort of FBI man, and a former communist who's being hunted down by him. Barbary Shore very much captures the mood of those years for those of us who felt that the powers that be were everywhere and were looking at us. And probably the most paranoid of all the novels I've written. The sense of Big Brother watching everywhere goes through every page of that book. Barbary Shore was trashed by the critics. It's not really a very good novel, but it was not nearly as bad as they said it was. Also, it was very left-wing. So it really did everything you're not supposed to do in 1951. And I received reviews you wouldn't believe, reviews that said things like pasteless, tasteless, graceless. This was Time magazine. People kept wanting the second volume of The Naked and the Dead, which wasn't there. I wasn't going to write another war novel. So, if you're young, you really have to have some kind of stomach or other to keep writing after that.
Tentatively, she reached out a hand to finger his hair, and at that moment, Herman Tepes opened his legs and let Bobby fall to the floor. At the expression of surprise on her face, he began to laugh. "Don't you worry, sweetie," he said. And down he looked at the frightened female mouth, facsimile of all those smiling lips he had seen so ready to serve at the thumb of power. And with a cough, he started to talk. "That's a good girlie. That's a good girlie. That's a good girlie," he said in a mild little voice. "You're an angel, darling, and I like you. You're my darling, darling. Oh, that's the ticket," said Tepes.
All right, I must have touched a button because that passage, at the time it was written, kicked off the most extraordinary business. The man who had published The Naked and the Dead refused to publish the book with that passage. I went through 6 publishers before someone was willing to take it. It gives a notion of the extraordinary prurience and conservatism of that period in American life. This is about 1955. And the Cold War was on, and with the Cold War had come an absolute constriction on the nature of morals, the freedom of sexual morals. Everybody was very popular. It was a time of when everyone spoke of the family and togetherness. And, people in America at that time considered themselves pariahs if they got divorced. They were frightened by the increasing sexuality of America. I mean, I exaggerate a little, but in fact, there was a tension and a puritanism in American life that we haven't seen again.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike.
The 50s, which started in that sense, started in 1952 with Eisenhower. And he was much beloved. He didn't stand for much, and he was terribly conventional, and life was pretty stultifying. People in America always identify with the president. It's quite different from Europe, where most people wouldn't for a moment think of themselves as being like the president. Here, our president is the equivalent of royalty for us.
First citizen out in Harrisburg to welcome home their first citizen, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Whoever the president was created the prevailing mood in the country. Eisenhower was a WASP. Eisenhower was a man who represented regularity, security, calm, lack of imagination. What he suggested to the country was, if you're not too imaginative, you'll do better than if you are imaginative. This is what came off him. This is how people reacted.
We're going to have a united front this November that's going to assure the victory for General Eisenhower that the country needs.
Victory for the party, and what is more important for the country, my boy.
In 1954 and 55, when the Deer Park came out, was the period in which I turned around. I suddenly realized I've been talking like a radical all these years, but I haven't really felt like a radical. I really felt as if I was part of them. I'm part of the publishers. I'm part of the whole literary establishment. And I'm not. When push comes to shove, they're willing to get rid of me. And I was in a deep rage. I came in contact for the first time in my life with the depth of my own rage. And it was large. Defeat has left my nature divided. My sense of timing is eccentric, and I contain within myself the bitter exhaustions of an old man and the cocky arguments of a bright boy. So I am everything but my proper age of 36, and anger has brought me to the edge of the brutal. In sitting down to write a sermon for this collection, I find arrogance in much of my mood. It cannot be helped. The sour truth is that I am imprisoned with a perception which will settle for nothing less than making a revolution in the consciousness of our time. Whether rightly or wrongly, it is then obvious that I would go so far as to think it is my present and future work which will have the deepest influence of any work being done by an American novelist in these years. I could be wrong, and if I am, then I'm the fool who will pay the bill. But I think we can all agree it would cheat this collection of its true interest to present myself as more modest than I am.